I think what we saw over the last couple of years that everyone needs to be aware of is the default solution was to throw people at every problem. You would have situations at a company where 6 separate teams would build the same service. And that was okay because we got to move fast and everyone's got to be really independent. So you'd see 6 versions of the same API to get different bits of data out of some service. And they're like, oh, we can't wait for that team to build their platform. We're just going to build our own thing. So you get 6 duplicate things. And I think just realistically, we went so far to the extreme on that level where people just throw people at it. We need to be independent. We need 1 PM for every 5 people. It doesn't matter whether we need a UX researcher per 14 people. Like any ratios that were default ratios were skewed to the let's move insanely fast model, and even the ratios of leadership. So once those ratios were off, it doesn't take that many higher levels of hierarchy for the whole gig to be up and have this very incoherent situation where leadership doesn't know what's going on. Middle management's worried about losing their job. The frontline teams are complaining, but nothing gets really escalated. And you just get this like wicked loop of lack of trust and nothing's going on.
Welcome to another episode of Supra Insider. This time, Mark and I sat down with John Cutler and Josh Herzig-Marx, both friends of the podcast who we've had on previous episodes. We sat down in this conversation and talked about a big trend that we're all seeing in the product community where product leaders are taking many months to find their next role, and many of the product leaders that we know are actively between roles. So there's just like a lot of folks on the sideline right now, and we wanted to talk about what we think the contributing factors to that might be. Our discussion touched on the flattening of product orgs, the role of AI, and the rise of super IC PMs, among a few other things. And then we spent some time talking about where we think things might go in the next decade. Really fun conversation. I am sure you're going to enjoy it. And I'd say it's particularly timely for folks who are between roles or thinking about maybe changing roles and want to get a sense of where the market is. Thanks for listening. All right, we're live. John, Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Good to be here.
We've had both of you on the podcast separately in the past, and I think we now see you as people we just like talking to about interesting things and chewing on what's going on in the zeitgeist. And there was something that was floating around a few weeks ago that Mark and I were chewing on in the Supra community with Josh as well. And then John, we saw you actually chime in on the post that triggered that discussion and wanted to invite you on to talk about it. So the high level is that there are a lot of product leaders right now that are out of jobs. I see this as part of my interview coaching, as part of my interview prep bootcamp. I also see it through the community with people reaching out, asking for help. And I think Supra has been doing a really good job of helping people prepare for interviews. But I just see it in general on LinkedIn. And I think we're all seeing something similar. And out of the people that are out of jobs, I think a lot of them have been in transition for multiple months at this point. It's not like little brief stints where they're looking for their next thing. Some people are finding themselves on a little bit longer term basis, seeking what's next. And I think there's a lot of potential causes for why we're seeing this trend right now. So I would just love to maybe start by asking you, John, what do you think are some of the biggest contributing factors for why we're seeing this kind of trend in the product leadership community?
Yeah, I think actually the phrase contributing factors is a good way to describe it because it's pretty complex, and it's probably likely you're seeing like a network effect or a flywheel or a wicked loop going on with some of these things. And just signaling out one thing, in many companies, there was a push to go multi-product. Like that was actually an investor mandate to those companies. Like if you cannot go multi-product, we don't want to continue giving you money. In fact, it was even more pointed than that. If you are incapable of going multi-product, it means you're not worth being invested in. And that was actually being communicated by board members and investors and VCs to particular companies. And this is similar. You could see as like triple double and those types of meme sort of benchmarks or whatever. And it had become a benchmark in the industry. And for a lot of companies, the only way that they could meet those growth expectations, and they had sufficient capital to do it, was to launch a bunch of new products. And so just that one cause, so you have this proliferation of products. You see this kind of rise of the GM type model. Because why? If you're trying to grow quickly, even if there's tons of dependencies between those groups, it's helpful to operate under the fiction that these are in fact independent groups and that you can assign each one P&L responsibility and a revenue thing. Even if you really know that it's the same customer and it's actually all intertwined, it's like helpful fiction to imagine that there's all these groups. So just that one little component there, and the growth of multi-product across the industry and the GM type model moving in that direction and optimized for speed probably did create a surplus of quote unquote products in the market. Simultaneously, in much slower growing companies with their digital transformations, they were under the impression that every group of 6 people need a product manager. Those companies are trying to adopt these product operating models where everything is a product. And if everything's a product, everything needs a product manager. And so think just those 2 factors simultaneously, like inflating the market at the moment. And then you've had this big contraction back to functional orgs. You've had this realization that most SaaS companies are like, the whole company is the product, not the individual products or anything like that. AI has stitched together many of the products in new offerings. And so I'll just offer that one. Like just that one probably created an inflation of the number of PMs. And the orgs got taller and wider at the same time with a bunch more quote unquote products. And that probably had some significant impact here, I think.
Cool. So let me just summarize what I heard so far. And then Josh, I'm curious if you have, I'm sure you do have something, but the first thing I'm hearing is that in a world where companies were feeling pressure from investors to become multi-product companies, there was a need to spin up multiple product investments and presumably have product teams with like product leaders and PMs for each of those investments, even if some were maybe less grounded in foundation and fundamentals than others. So that's maybe one factor. And then I'd say the second factor is that there's an assumption maybe that if you're going to maybe invest in building a lot of things and have a lot of engineers, then you have to maintain some kind of ratio of PMs to engineers. So as you grew engineering headcount, there therefore had to be a bunch more PMs that you hired to stay in that ideal ratio. Is that fair?
Yeah. And just a finer point on that, that in these product transformations, in addition to just the ratio thing, it was this idea that everything is a product. Even if legitimately 80 people are working towards one product, you had like search bar top, search bar middle, search bar bottom teams and submit button teams. Like
all the different
that
pods.
anytime you had 3 or 4 people together, you had to have a PM and invent a product around it. So that was one of the things.
Josh, curious what's going on in your head. What do you think?
Yeah. So first of all, I really appreciate, John, as always, you placing these kind of personal observations that someone looking for a job might have in the larger macro story about our industry. It's something that I almost always forget to do. I'm super concrete, super tactical. So that's where like my 2 insights are going to come from. One of them is something that I hear Phil Terry talking about as well, which is that rewind the clock 4 or 5 years, I would talk about how companies are generally pretty bad at hiring. Most people don't get trained to do it. Most companies don't have a strong process to do it. Maybe some of the really big ones do, but even I've heard criticisms of our internet scale companies struggling with like getting a good process out. Who were the first people laid off in this most recent downturn? It was recruiting, HR, and people ops. If companies were bad 4 years ago at hiring, there is nobody left in the organization who knows how to write a real JD, build a hiring process, run candidates through a candidate-friendly hiring process that's going to result in an offer being made to a candidate who's going to accept it. And if you don't know how to do that as an organization or as a hiring manager, it's unlikely you're going to be able to fill your roles. And in the process, you're going to frustrate a whole lot of really awesome candidates. So even though I see a lot more jobs open than I did even a year ago, it's still a really frothy process, and it's going to be really frustrating both on the hiring side and on the candidate side. So I see that as being one very common situation. The other one is I think that product managers, and I hold myself in this group, have possibly developed an overly inflated sense of what a good job might be. We wanted to work for the big internet scale companies, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Stripes, maybe the Microsofts, the Airbnbs, the hot companies. We wanted to work for not just any old startup, but the ones being funded by tier 1 VCs. We wanted a company that's going to look really good on our resume for the next job and the job after that. And I think that only now candidates are starting to rediscover how many great jobs there are at great companies that fly under the radar screen. I had a conversation just earlier today with another Supra member. I was laid off from a great kind of internet scale, well-known brand company, spent some time looking, ended up at a tech-enabled company where people don't even think of them as having like even a real tech department, and he's loving it. He's making a real difference. It's a mission-driven organization. The team he's working with is small. This is not product operating model. This is not engineering excellence, but they're people who care and they work really hard, and he's feeling like he's making impact and feels really good about it. And I suspect that a year ago, this opportunity wouldn't have been on his radar screen. So I'm seeing people start to rethink what's a great opportunity, and that makes me happy as well, because there are a lot more openings in tech in general than there are at Google today.
Yeah, that's actually such a good point. I think like a good like similar point there is, I think for the longest time, like people have seen their career success as like, I get more teams, I get more reports, I get just a larger sphere of influence. And I think what I'm seeing a lot of people too is like, they're like, oh, like I'm not going to take a job that is a downgrade from what I had before, right? If I was a VP of product or if I was a people manager, like it feels like such a huge step down in my career to maybe go to a principal role or maybe go to a senior PM role. To your point, I've talked to a lot of people who actually have made that shift from group PM or director or even VP to principal role, and they're extremely happy. They're like, I don't have to deal with any of the things that I hated doing, like managing people problems. I'm actually like getting better at the craft of product, which is why I got into this on the first place. And I feel like I'm shipping things and I'm moving quickly and I can make decisions and I don't have to wait on people on decisions, which I think is like another point around like this flattening of the org, allowing people to actually ship product faster and have more impact and probably ship better products too.
Maybe that's the blessing of being a few months out of work, is you realize you can enjoy not waking up at 4 a.m. in a cold sweat because you're responsible for maybe a few too many teams and maybe a few too many meetings with the board of directors. And you're like, I could just be a product manager. I mean, speaking just for myself, I think I'd love for my next job if I go back to work being an IC role. Principal, staff, senior product manager in a org that's a lot of fun, doing work I find enjoyable, work with people who I like. That sounds fantastic. Not having to go to board meetings, not having to sit in the 2-hour Monday morning SLT meeting. Sounds great. Who wouldn't want that?
I think one of the reasons people, I think, got pulled upwards in the desire to have more reports and empire build too, in some capacity, is that there was an expectation they'd make more money, obviously doing that too, and higher compensation. And I was reading, Lenny recently released, I think, part 2 of one of their compensation benchmark surveys that they've done. And it sounds like one of the most surprising findings is that the top end of the senior IC scale of product managers is now catching up with, if not surpassing, what we might consider historically like the group PM, maybe even like more junior director level compensation packages in a lot of companies, which is a really encouraging trend that we've seen historically already in engineering. Like the most senior engineers would always get paid as much as like directors in a lot of tech companies. And now we're starting to maybe see that compensation bands go up higher for ICs as well, which hopefully makes that quote unquote step backwards for people who used to be directors or VPs to go into the principal IC role less painful from a bottom line perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like in this world, and the people who are like really in trouble or quote unquote in trouble are the people who are like very junior. Then they're like, oh, like at that point, I'd rather get someone who has maybe 4 or 5 years of experience, or someone who has been doing people management for say 15, 20 years, that they have been so removed to the action. They're like, they have less options. Because I feel like if you're like, if you have, I don't know, like 5 to 8 years of experience being an IC, like you probably can fluctuate between the two pretty easily. Yeah, I'm not sure. What advice would you have for those people? Because I feel like they're in an awkward spot.
Yeah, I think you actually see that a lot in the design community, and it's pretty scary actually, where design leaders, like legit design leaders with multi-decades of experience, who've worked very hard in a mix of companies, both like FANG companies and these sort of tech-enabled companies, as Josh called them. And it's extremely difficult for them at the moment because they're almost experienced out of where the market is at the moment, and they're perceived not to be down in the weeds, like not hands-on. And I think that's like an unfortunate mix of maybe positive elements of the current environment, like the need to be hands-on and let's like focus on being efficient and getting this stuff done and getting back to work and doing it. And maybe the not so great elements of the current environment where whether they're called, I posted recently about glue type roles or catalyst roles or enablement roles. And you can even see some of these leadership roles in that position. And there's a lot of pain in that community because a lot of those folks were the first to be laid off after HR, like enablement roles, glue, and any type of role that sort of seemed like, oh, it's extraneous stuff. So yeah, just noting how complex that is, where you have people who are legitimately great leaders and have mobilized dozens and dozens of designers or hundreds of designers in orgs are now found scrambling, where even some of them are saying very openly on LinkedIn, like, I will go back and be you think I will prove it to you that I can go back on a team and be an IC designer. I'm not going to be pigeonholed by the current market landscape and by my own experience. I'm not going to be pigeonholed by my own experience and have it make it seem like I can't do this craft thing. So it's so interesting out there, like a mix of good and bad is a way to see it.
Yeah, I describe this as to some people as the potentially dangerous perception on behalf of the company that you are too senior to do the job or not interested in rolling your sleeves up to do the job, and trying to position yourself in any way possible, really. I think it's one of those markets right now where you got to take every edge you can get. And I think candidates who are in the boat that you're describing, historically managing lots of people who are interested in actually getting into an IC role and rolling their sleeves up, should be really explicit about that, I think, in conversations with people. I don't see it sometimes come through as clearly as it should.
It's something that I think it's something that's been present in very early stage product leadership for a while, or at least not uncommon, right? The founder decides it's time to bring in a product manager. And because they see it as being a solo IC role, because they're worried about cash preservation, they decide they're going to hire somebody more inexperienced, somebody fairly junior, just to do the work. And at some point, a lot of VCs seem to have wised up and started shifting the recommendation towards it's okay to hire somebody experienced. They can do the individual hands-on tactical work on day one, and they can be a player coach as the organization grows, and they can be the ones who manage that. And there's a whole bunch of folks, I'm one of them, who have done this multiple times in a row, and it's been successful. I think part of what happened is there was a change in the overall market narrative. And if we want to help our friends who are experienced design leaders, who have a ton to give, both in leadership roles, manager roles, and IC roles, and as those change, I think one of the things that we can do is we can spread the gospel of people are capable of multiple things. We are complex. We have multiple overlapping skills, and organizations that expect to be changing substantially over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, which is to say growing funded organizations can benefit from hiring somebody who is also complex and who also can do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I was just smiling for the listeners when you said, just do the work. It's such an underestimation of an entire company is just doing the work, right? Like that's literally what like $1 trillion company or $3 trillion company is full of each individual just doing the work. So that's how you build.
Ben, it's all ones and zeros inside the computer, 2 numbers. How hard can it be?
How hard can it be? I'm curious what you guys think about this, but I've been toying with this idea in my mind that the idea of a junior product manager is going to go out of style, or it's going to become, it's almost like there's something fundamental to me about just a product manager as a job that requires a level of seniority and leadership, that it's almost like if you can't do the basic senior thing, it's hard to be effective in the job at all. And I'm curious if you guys would agree with that. John, looks like you've got something. Or Mark, you too. I
have this strange prediction that in a couple of years, the PM to engineer designer ratio will be like 1-30 or 1-50. And I think that this is going to sound very strange, but I've been thinking about it a long time. So much focus is on what the product team does. We think about product teams. And then there's focuses on what like whole orgs do when you have thousands of people. And the whole GM model was all about, okay, product areas, my product. But I really think what's going to come to the forefront is this sort of middle definition of what is the acceptable size of a self-improving, psychologically safe, trust-building, profit-making entity. And I think it's 30 to 50 people. Like 30 to 50 people can make lots of money for a company, can make hundreds of millions, make tens of millions of dollars. 30 to 50 people, like 6 people can also do that for a tiny startup, but at a certain point you need more people. So maybe on the lower end when you're earlier, and then 50 is like the extreme end when things are more stable. And that's just about the rate where you can call it a product. I don't want to hear about the 3 people owning a product. It's probably not a product if 3 people are owning it. So 30 to 50 people feels just about right. That's the acceptable boundary for these things. And then you get a mix. So imagine, just to your point, Ben, it's this PM, their design counterpart, and an engineering lead. And then they have the shared functions like UXR, quantitative research, an ops function, maybe a research ops or design ops function. So that's about 6 or 7 of those people total. And then the rest are just teams. And I think you're in the environment right now that if most designers and engineers that are more product savvy and have been working in organizations do not need a ticket writer. They just don't need a person just because they're 6 people that they have that type of thing. And I think one benefit of that situation is there's many paths to become a PM. You want to start as a designer? Do you want to start as an engineer? Do you want to start in an operations function? Do you want to start in an analyst function? Do you want to start in product ops? Sure, go ahead. But I actually wholeheartedly agree. The number of companies that I see that tried to have a sort of junior PM type program and then flipped completely on it and realized it was a disservice to the teams. Like the better the teams got at product, the more ridiculous it became for them to be essentially coaching a PM. So you'd have people with 10 to 15 years of experience and a PM with 2 to 3 years of experience. That just feels weird. Like it doesn't seem to benefit everyone. And then the career ladders for PMs becomes this geometric nightmare where you're never going to move up in this like highly competitive pyramid like that. So I don't know. That's like an extreme prediction, but I think I could see it going in that direction actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like if I look at the like prestigious APM programs and the reason why they have like junior APM programs, I see their strategy is a little bit different from my point of view. Like their strategy is like, how do I attract very high potential people who just graduated college, who will be like those 10x PMs. And I'm willing to take the loss, right, of like productivity, et cetera, for the maybe like the first like 3 to 4. So then, or maybe it's 2 years to then have like really smart people who are very competent. So I don't know, those feel like unique in that way, but I don't know if every company has the luxury to do that because they don't have a quote unquote brand that maybe like Meta or Google have. But I think that the question that I have for you, John, is I agree that I think that's where the world is going, where you'll have 1 PM for many engineers. But then the part that I'm struggling to see is how do you get there? Because you cannot go from being a designer to then all of a sudden being responsible for like a multi-million-dollar product when you haven't done product for a while. So what does that progression look like? Is it like, it feels like a very...
I think that in fairness, this is not so dissimilar to what's happening in a sense, because I'll just put it this way. There are groups of 30 to 50 people working right now. They're in their product area. The difference is that the relationships between the frontline PMs, it's almost like 1 PM with assistant PMs sort of doing their thing. Yeah. You have the Triad Model or whatever, where you have people who have already reached that sort of senior level or starting to manage level designer at that thing. So the way I make it sound like probably sounds extreme, but it's not too much of a shift. I think what it really means is, would it be possible to just remove and then offer career paths through the operations type role, through design, through other things? And I would say this is how it exists in consumer goods and other things. In more stable domains, you tend to have a much bigger ratio between the owner of that product line and their design and engineering counterpart and the people doing the things. Maybe it sounds way more extreme than it is, but that's what I would imagine the step that it would need to be in certain environments to do that.
I think it's interesting talking about, I know a little bit about consumer. I spent some time in grocery marketing, very excited. So spent a lot of time in companies like that. I've been thinking about the weird situation that we put ourselves in as product managers, where we assumed responsibility for a lot of different kinds of work across the organization. like discovery. Who owns discovery? Is it the product manager? Is it designer? Designers feel, I think, often rightfully very frustrated that discovery was taken away from their discipline and brought into product management. And the way that we stratify ourselves around scope. Is our responsibility a feature? Is it a product? Is it a product line? Is it however we want to do it, right? But that's how, as you gain more experience, you gain responsibility for a broader scope of whatever it is that your company builds. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to go back to do what literally every other discipline in the organization does, which is divide yourself up by the kinds of work that you do. Are we going to find large organizations where there are people who specialize in product analytics? In fact, you see some big companies that have like data teams about that. Another thing that product managers tended to grab is data analytics from the data analytics specialists, whether it be people doing that, whether people be doing surveys, people who are specializing in product discovery and market discovery. I think we see a little bit of this with product marketing today as a discipline. Will the roles spread out that way? Different organizations concentrating them in certain ways, different organizations making them more diffuse, and people moving from one specialty to another in the same way that we see that oftentimes in marketing or between sales and biz dev and partnerships, how people rotate inside of different kinds of roles and use that as a way to ratchet up their responsibility and their seniority. I have no idea, but I do have a really hard time imagining working with not as many as you, John, or you, Ben, but quite a few early stage tech companies. Very few engineers that I've spoken to really want to own more of the product work. They may get frustrated at product management, but a lot of them, they just want to code, right? They want to solve coding problems. And it takes an unusual person inside of a company with unusual leadership to really force the rest of the organization into taking that kind of responsibility for business outcomes. That's been like the one thing the product managers consistently pride themselves on. So
this is actually, this is an area where I think that like companies like Facebook, I think have actually figured something out in how they incentivize engineers, and they make it really clear that above a certain level of seniority, the engineers in my team, if I had a level 5 engineer or level 6 engineer at that level of seniority, they know that writing really good code will maybe account for like less than 50% of what they're evaluated. And the other impact that they need to show is that their ability to drive projects and to operate in ambiguity and to make an impact on the business. And I think that, to your point, Josh, I think a lot of engineers want to just code. And I think that a lot of companies shouldn't accept that. And I think companies should potentially consider ways to filter out engineers in their interview process who want to just write code, unless they explicitly need people to just write code, in which case they should hire them. But to John's point, if the ideal company, let's say business unit size for a well-established product is maybe 50 to 60 people, which is actually what we see with Linear, for example, right? Like 60 people. Linear is building a great business with 60 people. And we had Nan on the show, a friend of mine, had a product there. I think they have one PM, maybe they've hired their second PM, but I don't think they're planning on staying true to the idea that every single project has to have a PM on it. They have really product-minded designers. They have really product-minded engineers. They're all using the product and are developing their own intuition on what could be better about it and what people need. They have a shared story about where the company's going and the goals. And given all that context, you could actually take a really senior engineer and a really senior designer and throw them at a problem, and they'll probably do a decent job of coming up with something that could like work, right?
One thing that jumps out about this is, and actually I could see it completely going in the direction Josh is talking about. And realistically, actually, good org design is a combination of these models. There are there's some times that centralized things are helpful, even if they slow people down. And there's times when decentralized, I think what we saw over the last couple of years that everyone needs to be aware of is the default solution was to throw people at every problem. You would have situations at a company where 6 separate teams would build the same service. And that was okay because we got to move fast and everyone's got to be really independent. So you'd see 6 versions of the same API to get different bits of data out of some service. And they're like, oh, we can't wait for that team to build their platform. We're just going to build our own thing. So you get 6 duplicate things. And I think just realistically, we went so far to the extreme on that level where people just throw people at it. We need to be independent. We need 1 PM for every 5 people. It doesn't matter whether we have we need a UX researcher per 14 people. Like any ratios that were default ratios were skewed to the let's move insanely fast model, and even the ratios of leadership. So once those ratios were off, it doesn't take that many higher levels of hierarchy for the whole gig to be up and have this very incoherent situation where leadership doesn't know what's going on. Middle management's worried about losing their job. The frontline teams are complaining, but nothing gets really escalated. And you just get this like wicked loop of lack of trust and nothing's going on. That's where we went into. I think we drifted so far in that direction, and organizations became so incoherent and no one knew what was going on. And everyone was worried and scared. And then that just made it worse because they were more obtuse and they were less transparent. Like we went so far in that direction that we have to imagine there's like some sanity has to pull us back, and just thoughtful org design, and not necessarily imagine you can throw people at everything, and not building 10 versions of the same service just because it's faster. Like all those things, I just can't see that being sustainable in the current environment. And maybe we could probably talk about what impact that would have for the PM career too. In a different environment, things change.
Can I be a little bit judgy for a second?
Yeah.
I think we get ourselves in that kind of a situation, which I've certainly been guilty of, when we pay too much attention to best practices or ideal ratios. And I got a stack of product management books on the shelf next to me that all have different variations on what best practices actually are, and do that instead of doing the hard work of inspecting our actual business and our actual strategy and what makes actual sense for us in this moment. Not every company is going to be a linear, right? Not every company is going to be a Salesforce or an Oracle. These are different companies, different markets, different strategies. But man, that thinking stuff is really hard, and I have no idea how to do it.
Yeah. I think it's also just, it takes a lot of intellectual discipline to just peel the onion and be like, wait, why are they doing that thing? And why, for example, like why can linear have like that ratio, or what is different from them than us? Like I think a lot of times, I think this content does really well because it feels very applicable, right? This company does X, so then I can go and do that. But then the moment you get into the context and you start to realize that every company is so different from one another, then this advice is no longer applicable. So then you lose the reader, because I'm like, this is great, but I cannot do that. I don't have engineers who like are very passionate about making product changes and want to drive business outcomes. So yeah, I think that's in a way, I almost feel like content, I don't know, era that we live in, where everyone's trying to build a brand and attract people's attention. Maybe it's driving to that in a way too. And I think also following companies that seem to be doing things really well and wanting to emulate them. I think that's part of what's going on here.
I've been inspired by some of what you've written, John, about this kind of almost like the universal application of best practices in environments where they're not likely to succeed. And sometimes like metaphors help me make sense of things, or analogies. And one kind of like visual that's been coming to mind for me is how we all know, like when it comes to, just take for an example, if you need to get a kidney transplant or some kind of like organ transplant, if your blood type doesn't match the blood type of the donor, that organ will get rejected by your body. And so every company has DNA. Every company has culture. And so if you try to take a best practice, which in my analogy would be like an organ from one company, and you try to just literally port it over into a different company that has a completely different culture and completely different DNA, the chances that it's going to be received and accepted is probably much lower than the chances are that will just be like rejected, because it just doesn't like fit there.
Yeah. And it's almost, I don't know if it's not going to be accepted, is that you're going to implement it. Like people are going to be like, cool, this company is doing it. And then you wait 2 months or 3 months and then it's not working. And you're like, wait, why is it not working? Like it clearly seems to be working for that other person. It's almost like I'm sure people, like I've seen it happen before. Like I've gone into my team to, hey, this person is doing this, I want to do the same thing. And people are open to it. I think everyone wants to get better. I think that the challenge then is like when it doesn't work and you're not sure why it doesn't work. And I think that's the tricky
it seems
part.
like that stubbornness. It's two thoughts about that is interesting to me. Is I do wonder whether the actual similar trait between companies that people point to is that there was just a group of people who are being thoughtful. And I liken it to the pandemic. I'm beginning to look back on the pandemic and see that individual strategies at individual times, it was very easy to pinpoint and say, I don't like that strategy that country's doing, or I don't like what they're doing. But if you look back and you look at the countries that fared better, it was typically places that had a common goal, that weren't divided and stuck to what they believed in, the stronger beliefs lightly held. And like when the reality changed, they were able to change their beliefs. Like the countries that only dogmatically did one thing, like you could be very collectively aligned around a dogmatic thing and fail, unless there's no perfect way. And you could be very aligned around the different versions of the right thing and fail to do it. So you look at these companies, there's a little bit of this halo effect or focusing effect where the people who are nerdy enough to talk about ways of working on public podcasts and things like that, almost by definition, are the people who think about it. And the IKEA effect is real. These are people who've been thoughtful enough to think about how they're working, to write the docs, to think about the topics and the things. And you begin to see that maybe it's not about what they actually chose to do. It's that they actually cared enough to do it. I've known people who work at Amazon. They were not around in 2000. And they're like, this is the way that we do it. And I was like, what happens? There's a collapse. Like they realized that the sort of monolith wasn't going to work. They realized that they wanted to introduce like statistical process control and the weekly business review. And they realized they wanted to just commit and double down to independent teams. They wanted to be a sort of highly individualistic Toyota, like very efficient, but in a very decentralized kind of way. You weren't around then. You weren't doing that hard work to figure that out. You're not writing a book about what it was like in 2002 to work through that and come up with this stuff. You're just copying what your company did because you said it was right. I was talking to a company the other day and they just had a forcing function around size of teams. And I realized that I didn't agree with the size of team rule they had, but I agreed with the fact that they had a rule. Because the rule allowed them to sense when things were getting off kilter in their company. They just wouldn't make teams bigger than a certain amount of teams. So although I didn't agree with the actual line they drew, I was like, oh, you're stubborn about it and you're introspecting and you're talking to me about it. So therefore, maybe it works. So I don't know. Those are two things to add to that.
Yeah.
Will Larson talks about this a bit, which I appreciate, right? He talks about building a culture through values, and he identifies good values as being ones that are discerning. I think the word he uses is reversible, maybe. So to your point, maybe it doesn't matter if the rule is team shouldn't be more than 10 people or 2 pizzas or more than 15 people, or here's the ratio of the triad or whatever it is, as long as you have one that forces you to make the decision, and in forcing you to make the decision gives you the opportunity to learn if it's working or not.
Yeah.
I think intentionality is really important, but I think probably the most important one to me is courage to go against like conventional wisdom. I think that's the hardest thing. Like another example is the remote versus in person. I think a lot of founders were like who started companies right after COVID or like even a year or two after, they're like, oh, like remote is new normal, so I'm going to start that. But they didn't take like the step of, okay, actually it might be much better for my company. We're all in the same room building together. And then I think a lot of them probably regret it now. They're like, now I'm in this thing that is really hard to undo. So yeah, I totally agree. Maybe now shifting gears a bit, I know that back to the framing of the conversation in the beginning of kind of in this situation where I think like leaders are having a hard time finding roles, there's less roles available for them. To what degree, and I think that the post originally like blamed like AI to be the contributing trend that's leading to that outcome. Do we actually think that there's something there? Do we actually think that AI is playing a role in just the ratio getting diminished, having less product leadership roles?
I would not. I would personally, just based on what I'm seeing in the market, I probably would not attribute things like flattening of PM orgs and shifting of expectations from people leadership to IC PM leadership. I would not attribute those, or at least I don't have enough evidence to attribute those trends to AI. But I'm curious if the rest of the group, what you're all thinking.
Josh.
Okay. I didn't find that a useful post. So I don't know if it's true or not. I also suspect it's not. As somebody who tries to use AI, I don't see this 10xing my productivity, maybe like 50% improving, 20%. Those are big numbers, but not enough to completely change the scope and scale of hiring for an entire industry. But more important, like that kind of assertion isn't helpful to me as a job seeker because it removes my agency and my ability and opportunity to improve my own situation as a candidate. I'm not sure who it benefits. And I think that's the thing that bothered me the most about it. okay, the world has changed. Now there's AI. So what do? Open a dog training kennel? Become an influencer on TikTok? What are my options open to me? Whereas there are still jobs open. People are still hiring, and you can still get yourself hired. It's not easy. You can get better at it. But like blaming AI for being out of work doesn't benefit you. Blame other people.
Yeah, that was a great way to put it. But well, I also think the other thing too is it could have been. I'm going to say this all the time. I'll take this other perspective that like it could have been any technology shift at the moment. I think what's most important for PMs, for example, I was doing a session with a product group in Australia, and it was like the presence of a new technology, which is shaking up how companies think about things, is also putting a premium on certain sets of skills. It could be anything. It could have been mobile. I mean, it could have been any technology or any shift at the moment puts new demands on PMs. It's, do you have, should I pursue deeper knowledge in this new technology? Should we hire people with much more like 0 to 1 experimentation oriented things? Do we need to move fast and break things, or do we need to have a really thoughtful company wide strategy on what it is? So I think that the presence of a new technology that happens to be coinciding with potentially a looming recession and the end of zero interest, like the fact that you've just layered this one little complexity lodged into the heads of executives probably is impacting the lives of PMs everywhere. You could have replaced any other technology though, I think, with that particular thing and gotten a similar effect at that particular moment. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to talk to like mobile PMs. I'm trying to remember whether I was like a mobile PM ever just because I happened to PM a mobile app.
Yeah, Mark.
Or we went the clock
go ahead,
further
Josh.
back to when like relational databases came out.
Yeah.
This isn't the first disruptive technology which changed how we engineer things, but fundamentally didn't change what we built.
I think Mark, I want to send it to you because I think the steel man of the case that that AI is a contributing factor is that the amount of leverage that a PM could potentially get out of an hour spent working theoretically with AI could be that like something like a PRD maybe takes them 10% of the time it used to take to write, something like that. So if you collect all the tasks that PMs do that require like synthesizing information, writing information, and you say, hey, now I'm expecting you to be able to use AI to do all those things, so I need less of you because each of you will be able to do more things. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's like the steel man for why AI might be a contributing factor in the reduction of the need for like more PMs. But I'm curious if that's consistent with what you're actually seeing in practice, because I think you talk to like dozens of product leaders every week. Are you seeing that actually play out?
Yeah, I think like the bigger question here is, do you know how to use your time adequately to spend in the highest leverage thing, right? Because even if you're saving like, let's say 2 hours or 5 hours or 10 hours a week with AI, if you're not spending time in strategy work, doing deep work, like it doesn't really matter what you like if you're saving that time because you're not allocating it in the things that actually matter. So I don't know. I think that's like the way I think about it is, yes, you can find ways that maybe like incrementally saves you like 5 hours, 10 hours a week, but it's a problem of, are you using it correctly? I think the only way that I've seen people being negatively affected by AI is if you go to an interview and you don't have any example of how you're using it, then I think people are like, okay, like this person is not really up to date with the latest trends or not playing with this thing that has the potential to make them more effective or build the next generation of products. Like I think that's the only time when I've seen it. Okay, or maybe, and I think it comes across as this person maybe doesn't have like a bias for action or they're curious. And I think that's maybe more of, I don't know if I want that person to be on building products and leading our product team. Yeah, what about you, Ben?
So it's less of an indicator, just so what I'm hearing from you is maybe someone being like on the cutting edge of playing with AI tools and knowing how to use them is less of a signal of the hard skills that you bring to the job, and maybe it's more of a signal about your cultural compatibility with the kind of culture we want to have and your openness to like playing with things and tinkering and experimenting with new tech. Because if we're trying to be at the forefront and do things that never been done before, then we need to hire people who like to be at the forefront and play with the cutting edge stuff and be early adopters. Is that kind of what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I'm seeing like a big obsession of like, a lot of people, especially Supra, a lot of people want to go into an AI role. Like they want to be working in the AI feature for their companies. And it almost feels like if they don't do that, like they're like being left behind and they're like perceived as less valuable, right? Like they're like, oh, if you have an AI title in your LinkedIn, like maybe you're worth maybe 20% more, 30% more. And I think I don't know if I agree with that take. I think like at the end of the day, like a really good PM is someone who's like just world class at solving really hard problems and coming up with solutions and being able to execute in a way that's unique that very few people can. And I'm not sure if just because you can use this tool or are familiar with it are going to be that valuable. I think there's maybe a little bit component of it, but I don't know. I think like they're putting too much weight into that and they're not thinking about all these other things that feel like equally important or if not more important.
Yeah, Josh or John, we'll let you maybe have the final word on this topic, and then we could start wrapping.
I think that it's on a number of levels. I think the funny thing is that there's a thoughtful way to think about AI, and then there's this sort of, when you see the leaders of companies saying we're all in on this, or we don't need to, we built Salesforce this weekend, we don't need Salesforce anymore. I think that the funny thing at the moment is the reality is this whole AI thing is definitely part of a very strong sort of narrative, virtue signaling, tech weirdness that's going on at the moment where people, it's used for anything. You want to challenge people's legitimacy as managers? AI, we don't need those. You want to challenge consultants? AI doesn't need that. You want to say, this is why you missed your profitability targets? It's because AI, we needed to invest in AI. And it's having it's real outcomes for companies. Yeah. In FANG, like large percentages of people let go because we've got to invest in chips or whatever they're doing. It's changed how people think about capital expenditure. There's all sorts of things. So it's almost like, yes, all these things are super important, but is it really about AI? It's just like AI has become the convenient sort of chaos monkey into an already pretty chaotic situation. So I don't know. It makes my head hurt to do it. Good for those podcasts, though. It's good for a little bit of fun here and there. I really like that podcast feature. That was good.
Josh, anything you want to add?
I got nothing. Last week you had Ben Sprecher on the podcast. He is about as much an AI maximalist as I know, and I think even he points out the what was it called, the demo trap. Did he talk about that?
Yeah,
we
how,
definitely talked about
the first 70% looks great, and then you actually got to go build something. So I don't know. It's cool. I love it. It's really fun to have it like rewrite jingles for you, and there's like legitimate value that tools like Chat PRD can deliver. But at the end of the day, what we're being hired for as product managers, whatever the role might be, is judgment, right? Is
problem
the person
solving.
who's going to take responsibility for outcomes in the absence of any control over the situation. AI isn't going to change that. And worse than that, the theoretical model where, hey, you only have one CEO telling the AI what to do, like how many CEOs really want that ultimate responsibility? There's a lot of value in shared responsibility. And then I'll just agree with John. It's really easy to talk AI, blame AI, whatever AI. It does get a little bit boring after a while. And I'd rather
it's a tool.
It's a
Like
tool.
LLMs could be more creative than our own parroting of AI.
It would be nice.
We're resembling LLMs in our own memification of AI, which is pretty funny.
Or maybe that just means we've been LLMs all along. All I am. Predictive text generation.
Was right. My God.
I feel
welcome to the simulation.
Yeah. You know what's funny is I think
I'm not here on this call.
When we look back in 10 years, I do wonder if we're going to look at this period in which we're all trying to make sense of what to do with AI, because I really do think every tech company is having some flavor of, there's a non-zero amount of meetings happening, if I had to guess, on a daily, if not weekly basis at every single technology company right now. And like, how are we going to use generative AI in some capacity in our product, or AI in general? And I do think sometimes we're going to look back maybe in 10 years and be like, the sheer number of hours wasted getting into a room with someone essentially holding up a hammer and being like, does anyone have any good ideas of how we're going to use this hammer? That's what I think a lot of these conversations feel like. It's not just a hammer, obviously. It's like more complex than that, but it's a tool. It's a technology, and I do wonder if there's a tremendous amount of time.
Well, that's where the companies that are doing the best at this right now, I find, are the ones that just focused on that sort of mix between platform and enablement, and just having teams know that this is a tool that they can put in the tool chest. And so they spend a little bit of time of abstracting the services. They spend a little bit of time just ironing out any governance issues or compliance issues with the company, like anything that they need to do to get to remove blockers. The ones that aren't doing as well haven't even gotten to that point yet. And it's basically an argument of who's going to do all the work. And then what they get into is that they could have been shipping that whole time when they were doing it and learning about the fact is, like, when the chat interface breaks down as the primary interface and everyone explores it, the ones that started really early figuring that out and adapting, like what Atlassian did with Rovo, is like a good example of, we've got a lot of data. They couldn't have done it that fast unless they made it somewhat easy for those teams to work on that, remove the legal hurdles or whatever they needed to do. And so that's a good example. They're like ahead of the game versus the team that's still thinking about what to do at that level. So yeah, that's interesting.
We do have like a naming problem in all of this, right? Because we talk about AI in tech, we're talking about two different things that happen to share like the same underlying technology. There is AI as a platform tool, right? In the same way that we have application servers, we have our relational databases, we got our vector databases, we got our all sorts of different kinds of underlying technologies. Now we have an extra one, which is LLMs and like everything else that's available, PaperSip, just like you pay for Snowflake, vertical databases. And that AI has gone through the very same trend that every other backend technology has gone through, right? First it was R&D, then it was a capital expense, then it was pay per use, and at some point it's become free. In the same way that fundamentally Snowflake is free for most companies. Not every company, but mostly the cost of Snowflake, the cost of your columnar database is so low, you can pretty much ignore it until you get to some kind of a scale. And we're seeing the same thing with AI, and that's great. And every good engineer is going to understand how and when to apply PaperSip LLMs in the same way they understand how to apply PaperSip columnar databases. That day will be fantastic, and we're just getting there a lot faster than we've ever gotten there with any other backend technology before. And then you have this other AI, which is like my productivity tools. We have no idea what to do with it. Are we leaking corporate data? Should we have our own private one? What about RAG? Should we train on our own data set to get our own LLM? How do these things work? I can illustrate my PowerPoints or my Google slide decks really nicely by plugging stuff into ImageGen or DALL-E or anything like that. It's great. I use it all the time. Product managers get themselves into trouble when they don't understand that their experience typing queries into Perplexity isn't the same as an engineer's experience optimizing a prompt so that they can return better results in, I don't know, their men's clothing store, their marketplace for apartments, their whatever product is they're trying to build. These are different things, and I think product managers like to overinflate, like all human beings do, their own knowledge of a technology because they use this thing as a productivity tool does not make it the same as what engineers are building. We just need two names for this thing that we're doing.
Yeah. All right. We could keep talking about this for an hour, but I think this was an awesome discussion. Covered a lot of ground. I enjoyed it, as always, talking to you two. And you too, Mark. But we get to chat pretty regularly. So I think the way we usually like to wrap as we close is where people can learn more about what you're thinking about and how they might be helpful to you. So maybe in reverse order, Josh, did you want to maybe go first?
Sure. You can go to jhm.lol or just Google my name. My parents gifted me with amazing SEO. But jhm.lol to find out who I am and what do I do. But if you really want to be helpful, you can go buy one of my wife's books so that I can continue to be a kept man and not have to get myself a full-time job again, which would be fantastic. Her name is Carla Nomberg. She writes books, funny books about tough topics, mostly about for parents and for kids. carlanomberg.com.
Awesome. John, how about you?
Yeah, I guess Substack for now, or LinkedIn. I guess it's, LinkedIn for now. That would be good. Yeah.
We'll share all the links.
I think John is not a very well-known online writer at all. His writing is very hard to find on the internet. We'll link to it in the show notes for people that have
also
never heard
great
of it.
SEO for a completely different reason.
Oh, really funny. There's some other things. It's awesome.
All right, Mark, that's a wrap.
Amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Cool. All right. Talk to you soon.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.